Okay, so we started at 5:45. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. It's a bit of a cold evening, it's a very grey evening, dull evening. Thank you very much indeed. A few housekeeping items before we start. The fire alarm is not due to go off, so if it does, it's real, and it's a continuous sound. If there is a fire alarm, you go out, well, you go out the way you came in, basically, straight through there now. Toilets are left, down to the end and left again, and we're in the little corridor then. It's my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, it's Professor David Finkelstein. David is Senior Research Fellow at the Department of Information Studies in University College London. He's been a long time academic and boasts over 90 publications. When were you going to get to 100?
A few years left. I've got a few years left.
Okay.
See what I get to.
And these are books, articles, learned papers, and so on. Principally on cultural history, but also on bibliographical topics, including some on or stemming from, arising from his enthusiasm for Blackwood's magazine, which is what he's going to be addressing us on this evening, of course. But his most important claim to fame is that he's been an EBS member for as long as he can. How long did you join?
Oh, that's a yes. Late 90s. Yeah.
Okay.
25 years. How about that?
But more important than that, he's been our treasurer, he's been vice president, and he reached the busy heights of president in the early years of the century. And I noticed there's one office that's escaped you so far, which is secretary.
No, I was that as well. I forgot to.
Oh, you've done that as well. I was going to say we've been looking for a secretary, and you've been adding to your. Oh, that's
in the early days when the magazine was coming out, I would be the one posting and sealing the letters with the stamps.
Okay. Anyway, David is going to address us on the topic of. Well, you can tell.
Oh, well, okay. Thank you very much. What a pleasure to be back again to Everbibliographical Society. I was mentioning to Derek that it's been many years since I attended the meetings, even though I have been a member, obviously, for well, the time mentioned, which is longer than I actually longer than I thought. But it's one of those things where I'm now kind of almost semi-retired, so I'm now in a position where I can actually attend more often. So I look forward to coming back and joining you in future meetings. But today I'm going to talk a bit about something that I hope you'll find of interest, published in this very city over 173 years ago. And I'm going to start by talking a bit about something I read just recently. There is, for those of you who do online reading and so forth, there's a space that's called Substack. It's where writers sometimes go and produce their blogs. And I was reading one by a guy named Michael Keynes, who was a former literary editor for the TLS, and he writes on things bookish. And he was wandering around a bookstore, book fair in Lewes this week, and shuffling around, he spotted this bookseller that was offering a number of titles on, as you can see here, speculative fiction and future war novels, right? There's all sorts of really interesting, the usual type of very old spines, not exactly exciting covers, but nevertheless, tales to be told within them. And in them was a rare copy of a book called How John Bull Lost London. I think that's kind of like, let's see, it's over here. Anyway, which was being offered for £95. A tale of the French taking the city by way of Channel Tunnel. So I thought, oh God, this is great because I'm thinking about that today. So what's not mentioned though was whether it also featured this very small sixpenny publication that actually sparked off this entire subgenre of fiction, a future war fiction. If it had, you probably would have seen it on offer because it tends to be around. When you do see it on offer nowadays, it's about 500, 700 pounds. And basically tonight I shall be recounting the tale of the story of this pamphlet's publication and the impact it had on British politics, culture, society. And this is just as you said, you can see it actually is a purple violet kind of cover, but clearly that didn't come out in the right way, given black and white slide I had there. So sorry. So let's start. In May 1871, Blackwood's magazine publishes The Battle of Dorking, which is an anonymously penned novelette, and it was become the sensation of the year. It was a fictional account of the results of a successful Prussian or German invasion of Britain, but its explosive and controversial theme fueled debates about national defense and spawned a new subgenre of science fiction future war tales. And demand for the work proved insatiable to the point where the firm, Blackwood and Sons, decided to republish it as a sixpenny pamphlet. And in doing so, in the next 6 months, they sold over 100,000 copies. It had been quoted in speeches by leaders of Britain's military and political establishments, and been denounced by Prime Minister William Gladstone as a panic-mongering work, mischievous as well as mad, keeping together a mass of impossible or incredible suppositions. Now, success with the Battle of Dorking was due to a combination of historical and cultural circumstances, as well as actually a really interesting calculated publishing and marketing set of decisions by the firm, William Blackwood and Sons. Prussia had just vanquished France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, marching its soldiers through to Paris and proving that the newly unified Prussian Empire was a military force to be reckoned with. And political nervousness at this newly risen power was linked with concurrent efforts to retrench and reform the military system of Britain by Gladstone's Secretary of War, Edward T. Cargill. So he was trying to obviously cut costs and reform. And as you can imagine, does anything new under that particular question? I can't imagine anything happening these days that would actually sound at all like that. As a result, the Battle of Dorking, with its depiction of the dangers of awaiting a military weakened Britain, provided this very powerful propaganda material for those who are fighting against, if you like, potential cuts in military expenditure, and then also those anticipating the need for an even better trained and better equipped nation. At the same time, John Blackwood, the head of the Blackwood firm's decisions in terms of business regarding the promotion and the production of the work then proved instrumental in expanding the appeal of this little tiny pamphlet beyond the pages of Blackwood's magazine. So at the time of writing, the Battle of Dorking was produced by Sir George Tompkins Chesney, but it was anonymous at the time, of course. But at the time of writing, he was a former lieutenant colonel in the Bengal Engineers, who, after distinguished service in India as a soldier, administrator, teacher, then returned to Britain in 1868, and he established the Royal Indian Civil Engineering College at Cooper Hills, Staines. He became its first president in 1871. So what happens is February 8th of that year, oh, I got John Blackwood here. Oh, I know. It's a few weeks after Franco-Prussian armistice was concluded, concerned about the lack of debate concerning Cargill's plans for military reform, Chesney writes to John Blackwood, there we go, to propose a tale, as he wrote, describing a successful invasion of England and the collapse of our power and commerce in consequence. The idea was well received by Blackwood, who felt that this work might help awaken people to the issues at large. So Chesney then begins writing, and he completes the work on this short tale in April, so 2 months later. And by the end of the month, the piece was ready to open in the May issue of Blackwood's. The work overwhelmed contemporary readers with its forceful rhetorical power and the translation of current political issues into descriptions of shocking military events. And you have to recall that at the time, the Franco-Prussian War, which began in September 1870, concludes in this unexpected humiliation of France and the temporary occupation of Paris in March 1871. This is fabulous. That postcard I found of ruins, and there you are, the arc swing off in the back with all these fortifications around it, and the Germans waiting to go in. That basically fundamentally altered the balance of power in 19th century Europe. Prussia's rise to strength from a collection of nation states to a unified military power was made complete with this victory. And France, which for so long was seen as a potential threat to Britain and British interests and security, was vanquished. And doing so was usurped by a more efficient and technologically superior and sophisticated force. The alarm over the rise of this newly unified political entity which harnessed new technologies and military strategies to upend traditional power structures, was then to feature greatly in conversations that were then occurring around Britain's future as a world power. And Chesney's work basically uses the distant narrative perspective of a volunteer who recounts the details of a German invasion 50 years after its successful conclusion. And the ease with which Prussia invades and conquers Britain in this tale is presented as a result of too many crumbling edges of empire requiring attention. So Britain's military resources are scattered to quell uprisings in India and Canada and Ireland, and its fleet is dispersed across 5 oceans. And the result leaves Britain bereft of trained troops and secure ports. And the result also is devastation and defeat within days of invasion. But it's not solely the lack of adequate forces which so decides this particular issue. So Chesney's strategy was also to expose what he saw to be inabilities of Britain's home defenses to confront disciplined opposition. Dad's army comes to mind here, a kind of Second World War parallel. As I.F. Clarke perceptively suggests in his definitive study on the subject, the point is they show enterprise, discipline, and exceptional military abilities. We are feckless, unprepared, and have been imprudent enough to send off the best part of our fleet on a fool's errand to the Dardanelles. And this latter point proved to be one of the story's most controversial features, ironically enough, considering the kind of the way in which it was interpreted by people representing conservative sources and political strategies. Those most disturbed by Chesney's work were actually of reactionary right-wing beliefs, opposing any work questioning Britain's military power. So the anonymous reviewer for the Saturday Review, for example, a journal which by the 1870s had become identified as a spokesman for England's upper classes, was keen in its support of patriotic political conservatism, spoke to and for a wide conservative audience when he sarcastically attacks the work's lack of suitable respect for Britain's naval capacities. And to quote, "The defeat of the British fleet by an enemy largely using torpedoes is, we say once more, a violent assumption. The country has a navy which would not be likely to allow itself to be destroyed by torpedoes. And it has in the volunteers a large and increasing number of able-bodied men familiar with the rifle. Well, were such an invasion to be successful," the reviewer added crustily, "the fault would lie not in the organization of equipment or the volunteers, but in the men themselves who would have undertaken to be soldiers without the least sense of a soldier's duty." And the effect of the subsequent opinions regarding these strategies that Chesney took in this volume were unprecedented and actually took Blackwood's quite by surprise. And as a result of the demand, the sales in the magazine rose by 65% from an average 5,300 copies a month to 8,100 for its May issue. And many of Blackwood's regular contributors wrote praising it and urging the firm to issue the piece in pamphlet form. "I am much mistaken if the appearance of the article, The Battle of Dorking, does not mark an epoch in the history of the magazine," wrote George C. Swain, a fellow of Corpus Christi College and one of Blackwood's favorite authors. "In your place," he urged, "I should print it as a pamphlet and circulate everywhere." And likewise, another stalwart, here we are, Blackwood's favorite female writer, Margaret Alford, well, aside from George Eliot. And George Orwell's wrong, that's right. Although I have a story about George Orwell and the Blackwoods, but anyway, that's a different story. Margaret Alford wrote urging republication, enraptured by the sheer power of the writing. "I had it read to me last night, and I have done nothing but dream of invasion all the night through," she told John Blackwood. So, with private communiques attesting to the literary power of Chesney's work, came similarly glowing public reviews. "Blackwood shines out with a marvelously interesting idealistic story with a moral," declared the Globe on the 1st of May. "No article that has been written on the fruitful subject of our panics can compare with that containing the reminiscence of a volunteer, which heads the new number of Blackwood's," added the Pall Mall Gazette. "Would you like a peep into futurity?" I don't know what that word is, but anyway, asked the graphic. "If so, read in Blackwood's The Story of Battle of Dorking." And the Spectator headed its monthly review of magazine articles with a long piece in praise of the work. "Everybody is talking about the first paper of Blackwood's this month," the review began, "and everybody is quite right. We do not know we've ever saw anything better in any magazine or any better example of the vraisemblance which a skilled artist can produce by a variety of minute touches. The reviewer concluded by urging the anonymous author to issue the work as a separate pamphlet. For doing so, he will produce an effect of which he little dreams, perhaps do more to arm England than Mr. Cardwell with his 16 millions will be able to accomplish. So, in light of all that excitement, and weighing up the public-private calls for republication, John Blackwood decides in late May to issue the work as a sixpenny pamphlet. Complete Battle of Dorking at once for publication next week, he telegraphs the Edinburgh office from London on 20th of May. The production of the Battle of Dorking was an experiment on its part, an unusual deviation from the firm's standard publishing practices, which were undertaken often with a thought towards minimizing potential risks and of overproduction and of poor sales. So up to this point, Blackwood's and the firm had rarely ventured into the idea of active publishing and promotion of works priced and aimed at a lower end of the publishing market, so sixpenny pamphlets and such like. Its fiction list consisted primarily of 2 or 3 volume works sold at high prices for circulating libraries or booksellers and railway stalls. And sale prices for those works rarely dipped below 21 shillings wholesale for a 2-volume first issue, or 8 shillings wholesale for a 1-volume reprint. So occasionally the firm would publish sixpenny pamphlets, but usually of a practical nature, such as tax guides or reprints of political speeches or atlases. So Chesley's piece was the first substantive piece of fiction to be issued by the firm in this type of cheap format. The firm's unusual strategy involved promoting the works directly to booksellers and agents through the efforts of sales representatives or the managers of the firm's offices in Edinburgh and London, and usually then followed by advertising in journals and trade magazines. The kind of examples here. In case of Battle of Dorking, the firm implemented a 2-pronged strategy. First they took steps to alert agents and sellers and buyers of the publication, and then they advertised it pretty heavily in weekly journals that featured the work in their review columns, and then throughout the summer months of 1871. And these ads were embellished with appropriate positive comments gathered from these reviews. And you can see some examples here of no article has been written on the fruitful subject of our panic and compare to that which has a new number, etc., etc. Right? So you have that kind of thing going on. More immediately, the day after John Blackwood's telegram is sent in May, the firm's Edinburgh office manager, George Simpson, notified 1,700 booksellers around the country that the work was to go to sale the following week. That was May, 3rd of June. Final proofs were then urgently solicited from Chesney to meet the publication deadline. So, with all these fabulous people notified about the impending procedures, the firm then took steps to sell the work directly to the public. And they did so. That's not done so much to bypass traditional sales venues, but as to actually exploit, satisfy the demand text. And they did it by selling directly to personally commissioned agents, was one way of doing that, eliminating delays attendant on regular distribution patterns. So bulk quantities of the work were produced and bound in Edinburgh and sent by overnight freight trains to London for sale. And areas of high volume traffic were identified in London, and street vendors, examples here, were hired to advertise and sell the work in strategic spots. Places that were specifically targeted included London's banking and journalism districts. We gave copies of the battle to 6 young gentlemen of the paved to start a street sale at the Exchange in Fleet Street and on Ludgate Hill, noted John Langford to John Blackwood on 5th of June, 2 days after the work went on sale. Railway stalls and other established street vendors were also contacted for sales representation. Sandwich men and all manner of flying stationers will, I trust, take to it greedily, was John Blackwood's hope. And that did indeed become the case. Initial results were extremely satisfying. The London manager, let's go back a slide because let's keep that. The London manager, Joseph Langford, reported brisk straight sales within the first 2 days. The small people, these guys, are all coming for second supplies, which shows that the public are buying. He reported to Blackwood's on 7th of June, so 2 days after they started doing all this. Although a cautious individual, he was very cautious, he felt confident that if railway stall sales matched street demand, sales would reach at least 40,000 to 50,000. And by July, his sales estimate had been well surpassed because the first month, over 70,500 copies had been exhausted. Another 27,000 were then run off. So there was anticipation that the sales would continue to grow, in particular after newspapers reported, and that's where this comes in, references made to the work by the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Cambridge in after-dinner speeches on the 28th of June. When the royal approval of it spreads, there should be a rush, said John Blackwood's nephew, William Blackwood, rather delighted, actually, on reading the report. By beginning of September, Although sales had slackened somewhat from the frantic pace of June, Black was able to report to Chesney that total sales of the work by then had surpassed the magic figure of 100,000 copies. Now, the thing is, the sales of the work kind of came, ebbed and flowed and ebbed between June and September, in line with increasing and decreasing social concerns and panic over the issues that were confronted in the text. And this tracked against the work's initial publication of Blackwood's magazine, its subsequent reissuing as a pamphlet, and the Army's successful maneuvering or mounting of maneuvers using its reorganized volunteer forces, an event dubbed by some the Dorking maneuvers. Yeah, look how marvelous set of recruits they have in there. So over this period, you see this subtle and increasing movement of the work then into the political arena. And after that, you see its infiltration into the cultural consciousness of Chesney's targeted audiences. Because Chesney's text then becomes identified as a powerful propaganda tool, a Tory propaganda tool, mediated by the fact that it had appeared in a magazine, Blackwood's magazine, a journal and publisher known to promote conservative policies. Gladstone's private and public reactions to this work, for example, suggested he viewed it as nothing less than a Tory-led attempt to counter Cardwell's cost-cutting and reforming proposals, and to inflame public opinion towards increasing military budget, despite the fact they were trying to move the other way. I must own I think it mad, he wrote privately to an aide. And then he later went on. Be on your guard against alarmism, he warned the public in a speech at Whitby in September 1871, denouncing the author of the Battle of Dorking for writing the work whose results would merely be the spending of more and more of your money. So, following successful implementation of Cardwell's reforms, the work starts losing its political significance. But instead, it becomes a reference point in popular culture, a title that becomes instantly recognizable and full of intended meaning. And the consequent hold of the work on literary consciousness of Britain can be seen in the constant referral and return in decades that follow to the subject of invasion that so clearly was lined up and stated in Chesney's text. Between 1871 and 1914, there appeared no less or no fewer than 60 works on the subject, ranging from fictional rebuttals to Chesney to highly technical forecasts by military experts. As I.F. Clarke notes, Chesney's work had the unusual distinction of launching a new type of fiction, a fiction in which the whole aim was either to terrify the reader by a clear and merciless demonstration of the consequences to be expected from a country's shortcomings, or to prove the rightness of national policy by describing a course of victorious war in the near future. The work was deemed important enough to merit a page of awfully written doggerel in Punch on 20th of May, 1871, suggests that the awareness of peace had already begun at this early stage to circulate widely among reading elites. The satire was not up to the usual standards of Punch, a fact bluntly noted by a reviewer. The Spectator wrote, for the first time we can remember, some singularly ill-written prose was by mistake printed in Punch in lines as if it was verse. And Punch, as you can see here, began by warning its readers. I'll give you a wee slice. Yeah, hold your ears because it's not very great. There's a Tory alarmist article in Blackwood's magazine. It's called The Battle of Dorking and has made a great sensation. Rhyme scanning. It's put in the mouth of a grandfather who describes what he has seen when England was invaded and ceased to be a nation. Now, there's more in that line. After several verses of plot description, the Punch verse dismisses the Battle of Dorking as a muddled piece of fiction, castigates its anonymous author for daring to suggest Britain could ever be defeated on home ground. Concludes, War Office and, sorry, even reading this is, War Office and Admiralty may have their share of bungle and blunder, but John Bull is not yet the brainless ass that Blackwood's prophet would make him. We may grudge the cost of our army's strength and of our navy's thunder, but if the British lions to sleep, 'twill prove no joke to wake 'em. Rah, they all are washing off. Satire was then would turn into light humor as time goes on. So by the end of 1871, once the war scare occasioned by the work had worn off, the work passes into the public domain as a light-hearted quip. Weren't you wounded at the Battle of Dorking? Became a stock question of anybody suffering from minor cuts and injuries. Got that right. Equally significant is the work's further movement into middle-class popular culture as light musical entertainment. So evidence of this comes in an announcement in the publisher circular of an enterprising development of the work into a piano piece. Mercer's Kramer Wood and Co. have published the Battle of Dorking in a descriptive piece of much force and vigor for the piano. The small notice confirms in September 1871. A musical version, though, alters the outcome, of course, to satisfy patriotic sentiment. Britain's drawing rooms do not resound to lyrics commemorating a Prussian victory over the British forces. Instead, after another bloody battle, they are driven into the sea, and the glory of England retrieved. Thus, disturbing and immediate threat of invasion, domination by a foreign power, which so colored the reactions to Chesley's text initially, are carefully neutered and rendered palatable for consumption as after-dinner entertainment in your parlor. I've yet to come across a copy of this, but I'm sure if anybody's found one, I'd be delighted to hear about it. So this movement from print context to mediated cultural reference can be glimpsed in various newspaper reports throughout the summer months. So let's return back to Prince of Wales and Duke of Cambridge, referring to the Battle of Dorking in toast at the annual dinner of the Royal Caledonian Asylum on June 28th, the one that John Blackwood was crowing over when he heard that they might be coming through. Afterwards, a prominent section in the Pall Mall Gazette was dedicated to the comments under the headline, "The Prince of Wales and the Duke of Cambridge on the Battle of Dorking." And as it was clear from William Blackwood's anticipation of increased sales following this report, this prominence simultaneously provokes and reinforces interest and knowledge of the work and reveals a level of awareness that then becomes, if you were, achieved by Chesley's pamphlet amongst military, political, and social circles. Implicit in such a headline, of course, was the assumption that Pall Mall readers would be familiar with the contents of the Battle of Dorking, and so will recognize that the debate between the Duke and the Prince was about military reform and Britain's level of military strength. At the same time, it doubtless made clear to other less knowledgeable readers that this is something they should pay attention to, this new cultural touchstone, and spurring them also to keep on, go off and buy, read, and become as familiar with it as their more enlightened peers, Duke and of course the Prince would obviously have seemed to be. Other social references to the Battle of Dorking can also be spotted in reports of a dinner in late June 1871, in which the Prince of Wales, Disraeli, Viscount Buchan, Liberal MP for London, and other members of Parliament were present. Now here, knowing laughter greeted Buchan's allusion to Dorking following a toast proposed to the Navy, the Army, and the Reserve Forces. He replied, "In that hall, the toast of the Navy was proposed before that of the Army. He did not know," the Times reported Buchan as stating, "whether that was because it was supposed there, as he hoped it was supposed in the whole country, the Navy was the first line of defense, and that before the Battle of Dorking was fought, it would have blown up the fleet of its enemies rather than have been itself blown up." Hey! Right. No explanation was necessary for the audience to understand and laugh at Goslin's jibe. After all, who could possibly seriously believe the instant disarming and destruction of Britain's most potent symbol of its national and international power? But Goslin's brief remarks also highlight this one interesting complex assumption that Britain's military and political elites drew strength from. Because regardless of the need or not for military reorganization, the one myth held sacred, if you like, was that Britain's navy was invincible. So the work's casual, fatal dispatching of Britain's vaunted navy within the first few pages of the narrative, shocking, subverting as it did these complex attitudes about Britain's Pax Britannica, as it was obviously labeled, and sketching this kind of radical portrait of a naval force stretched to breaking point by commitments to overseas possessions. And the fact that it had a minimal home-based force sunk within hours of invasion by a lightning-fast and efficient concentration of superior and overwhelming German forces. Technology, that did not please many of Chesley's military peers. Because the implications that Britain's home-based volunteers forces were equally inadequate and shoddy also grated against general beliefs about Britain's military prowess. And this was bolstered through years of high-profile military action overseas. Clearly, those actions then covered a whole range of thoughts about what the military stood for. And as the reviewer for Spectator made clear, it was the direct manner in which the Battle of Dorking confronted, made apparent, deflated through use of this fictional narrative strategy, these popularly held beliefs that really disturbed and impressed. And to quote, so powerful is the narrative, so intensely real the impression it produces, that the believer in panic cannot read it without a flush of annoyance, or close it without the thought that, after all, as the world now stands, some such day of humiliation for England is at least possible. The suggested condition, precedent of invasion, the destruction of fleet by torpedoes attached by a new invention to our ships, has attracted many minds, and with the destruction of the regulars, the helplessness of the brave but half-organized volunteers, and the absence of arrangements, make up a picture which, fanciful as it is, we seem as we read it almost to have seen. It describes so exactly what we all feel under the circumstances. Englishmen, if refused time to organize, would probably do. The text disguising of polemic as fiction so provokes these fierce responses amongst its readers. And I think that's the point about this whole story, is that the remarkable confluence of text and contemporary political and social concerns and the reactions to its text were also cleverly exploited by Chesney's publishers. So you have that mixture of printing, publishing, the use of advertising, and the thinking through of how you promote something. And they used, as I mentioned, an unusual series of marketing strategies to then ensure that it became an astounding success as a commercial product. And so what happens is, after this, is that it subsequently moves from that print context to embedded cultural reference, or political and then cultural. But however, one of the most telling achievements is this, that it would inspire a whole range of future war tales and invasion. So it inspired H.G. Wells in writing War of the Worlds, a future invasion scare novel with similar narrative structures. Its warnings about German designs over Britain would be picked up by John Buchan in his Shilling Shockers, John Standfast and the 39 Steps, and by the Anglo-Irish writer and revolutionary Erskine Childers in the Riddle of Sands. And these are just some of the novels that come up, which are obviously have become culturally relevant even today. There's a constant reprinting of the novels, but also the turning into TV series and films, and the constant return to the questions of how Britain's military stands and how you recreate or think about it in terms of fictional spaces. So for over 40 years then, this 64-page sixpenny pamphlet was to prove, 1870 to 1914, a major source of reference to Britain's literary and cultural discussions, until, of course, its prophetic call for military organization and revision was realized in 1914. And there's another story of something else. Thank you very much. That's I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, David. We've got a period for questions or comments. Anybody like to kick off? Yes, sorry.
Did the young Churchill read it?
The young Churchill reader. Oh, I'm sure he did, because everyone else did.
Yeah, and then the next one I've got is, was there, because I'm interested in, reception abroad, did our dear German Prussian cousins, who understood English very well, possibly Prince Albert and all, did the Germans publish it in, did it have a later life translated into Europe?
Yes, so there were a lot of translations or variations or versions in French, Italian, Spanish, German. It did kind of cause a wave of European response. Not necessarily in the way that obviously might have been different, as in, yeah, sure, we'll go to Britain and invade them, sure, no problem. But the other ones would have been thinking about it in terms of their own kind of spaces as well. Italy, they definitely, what do you call it? They translated it, but also there were riffs on it as well. So, yeah.
My only follow on was, did Mr. Chesney, like Walter Scott, come out? Was it?
Well, yes, eventually he was outed. Yes, because after a while he started getting worried about his job, because clearly he was like, oh, I'm a teacher at the military college, and they're going to find out. But also he was more of a liberal than he was a conservative, so he was also kind of concerned that Gladstone, he was more in favor of what Gladstone's doing, but nevertheless, his work had been taken out and turned into something else. So eventually, he was outed, as it were, but that was a few years later.
Did he get any royalties?
Come on, this is 19th century Victorian publishing. We don't get royalties. No, we got a nice big chunk of money, but that was, he didn't get any royalties after that. Yeah, got 500 quid, which was quite a lot.
Yeah, what about Crimea? Because people there were the terrible things where people trying to do stories about the mess
Yes.
up. The British were completely unprepared for the Crimea, and that was
Yes.
20 years before.
Yes,
So
I'm sure there are a lot of things written
I
about that
mean,
as well.
and you go to another college now, you do wargaming, and then at times given a first class, say, here's a situation, deal with it in fiction, because it just might arise. This is imagination.
Yeah.
And there we go. I defer to. I've got learned counsel in the back row here. May care to ask you a question as well.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Who wants to go next? Yeah, Leonard Council at the back.
Chesney was writing about a Prussian invasion of Britain, but for the next 25 years, France was the nation that featured in what I call invasion literature. And one of the most important, one of the last, was this book, which is The Great War in England in 1897 by William
Oh, the queue.
Le Queux.
Yes,
Yes.
fantastic.
I found this in an auction like 3 years ago.
Oh.
I got it for the printing sum of £8.
See that? It's probably worth at least a tenner now.
Anyway, this one has the invasion happening in 1897. The book was published in 1894. And in this case, it was the Russians and the French who invade. And it's almost exactly the same. That we're not prepared.
Yeah.
The English are plucky, but are doomed to defeat because we're not organized. And in the end, the only reason that Britain is saved is because the Germans come and save them by sending over an army.
There, yeah, fantastic. Yes, no, he's Le Queux is well known for that. He's probably one of the better known follow-ons, if you like, in terms of fiction.
I have to
That
say,
stuff,
it's
yeah,
a
it's
really
fantastic.
pedestrian piece.
Well, yes, true.
Really beyond belief.
Popular culture at the time, what can you say? Yes, great stuff. It's also some
People said Colin Quarter of the time. They're obsessed with detail.
Andy, yes, please.
I was noticing that the May 1871 date of publication, and the Franco-Prussian War had concluded by that point. But of course, something else was happening in Paris at that point, or was actually being fairly brutally put down in Paris at that time.
Yeah.
And yeah, the Paris Commune, and that episode of class war effectively sets off a very different train in the speculative fiction of the period, because you've focused in on this subgenre of the future war fiction, which is, as it were, externally facing, thinking about inter-imperial rivalries and the potential spillover into violent conflict, which of course does, as you say, happen in 1914. This stuff is peculiarly clairvoyant in a way, isn't it? I mean, it does happen in 1914. And then, of course, you get 1917, right? And so in your sort of research into the reception of the Chesney text and the sort of subgenre that it provokes, have you seen anything that links across the anxieties about imperial degeneration across into the more potentially domestic anxieties about class war? As we move into the 1880s, we get the socialist revival, don't we? We get the emergence of the SDF, the Socialist League. We get kind of Marxists in Britain in the 1880s who themselves develop their own pretty fierce critique of British imperialism. And of course, Wells is doing a version of future war fiction. He's also doing speculative fiction that's a bit more utopian in character. The flip side of the anxieties about the future is that maybe the future could be better. We could kind of push things in a different direction. So is your account of this future war subgenre, have you sort of thought the connections between other kinds?
And I think, I mean, this is not really original, but I certainly, I'm not original, I have to say, but I found a few scraps, but the person who I think everyone quotes as the definitive discussion about is by I.F. Clarke, where he talks about future war invasions, and he documents that whole history from before right through to all the things I was mentioning and some of the texts we've just talked about. And I think he does pick up on that particular question of it's not just future war Germany or France or anything, it's also the fear of other things, the fear of the underclass, you know, to mention, and also the way that they become enmeshed in this fear of loss of power and imperial domain. And that's, I mean, I didn't talk about it too much in terms of how it filters through Battle of Dorking, but except in terms of its military strategy. But it is a clear subtext. I think you're right. It picks up to other texts in the future. obviously his book is much better in terms of describing it than I'm able to do here. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
I'm intrigued about the impact this might have had on the poor benighted town of Dorking.
Yes, there's a lovely website that says, "Come visit Dorking." The battles in the. That was
Secondly, did thousands of people make a headway for Dorking to go and have a look at the devastation, the Huns?
Yeah, well, no, it wasn't
Did
quite
the
war of the
population of
Worlds.
Dorking flee
Yeah.
to Brighton?
Yeah, no, I mean, it became a tourist attraction, actually. A lot of people used to go to, oh, it's the battle. Where's the battle? And then they'd have pubs that would sit and go, well, it was just down the road over there. Yeah, I'll tell you where it was. I was there. Oh, will you? Yeah, buy me a pint. So there was a few of that, but no, you're right. Dorking was just chosen because it was kind of midway between the point that was meant to be invaded and then London. So it was like kind of like he didn't really choose it because there was any military strategy. It just happened to be. Okay, we'll choose that one.
Okay.
So yeah, but there's some websites that are dedicated from Dorking, which specifically play up the whole Dorking thing. Because what else are they talking about? I guess is why not talk about Dorking? Why not? Come visit us. It's an official space.
Actually, Dorking was of military significance because it's in a gap in the South Downs.
Yes.
And if you can get through that gap, you've broken the high ground. And the following year, I think it was, the army held huge maneuvers with the Duke of Cambridge
Yes.
in charge with about 33,000 men, perhaps to demonstrate that, look what we can do.
Yes.
We can defend ourselves.
And you're right, but the point was that also the arrival of the ships could have been anywhere. So I guess he was also trying to triangulate on the basis of the arriving here or arriving there. And that becomes a kind of way of passing through to London, isn't it?
It is.
Ah.
Is there any possible significance to this being basically the route that William the Conqueror was trying to take?
I haven't followed that through. That's a very interesting point. Yeah, actually.
I don't think Dorking existed in 1060s.
Well, it probably did. It's
Inga.
Saxon-ended.
People of, yes, you're right, yes.
Could be,
Yeah,
could be.
it probably did.
There's a conference paper there. You could come back and show us.
May we ask if there's any other military men of just the military profession of that era so writing their memoirs to make people aware of what real military life was like at that time. We're actually thinking of Tolstoy in his early writing about Sevastopol and so forth, just about the completely unexpected in war, and then the fact that men of arms could actually write good fiction. I mean, Tolstoy must have been prevailing later, War and Peace and so forth, but the very act of writing, who's there? A man called James Grant who wrote a book when he was in Scottish Defence and designing uniforms and all that. He just wrote a book called The So-Called Romance of War, but that was with respect to the Peninsular Wars and how bloody messy and graphic it was. But he was writing in about the 1860s.
Yes.
And because he had knowledge of the military, but to take them, the army actually needs all sorts of creatives, and the ones that think outside the box are extremely important. So that they have had a salutary effect without being a so-called or disloyal in a funny way. How do you square that with them?
I think it goes back to the point mentioned by our esteemed councilman, William McHugh and others like that, where obviously
And when
not exactly writing very well. So
yeah, well, the point doesn't matter. Also, is that we're meeting them today. You're so pertinent.
Yes.
I mean, brought up this bloody bit of fiction, which is closer to reality that our dear politicians would love to know.
Yeah.
Well, someone described it once.
Gag on that fella.
Yeah, well, someone once described to me that history, everyone talks about it being a pendulum from left to right, but actually Hinduism is more like a spiral. So it goes around the same points, but it just moves up a little further along. So it's similar patterns, but maybe not necessarily just going back and forth. It's just,
I think more like.
so maybe we're at this point in a spiral, whichever point you think it is.
Get your best analogy.
There you go. There's an analogy for you.
A better analogy.
Oh, you got a better analogy. Okay.
That's Karl Popper.
All right. Okay.
Okay, yes,
This
please.
is shifting just a bit. You mentioned that up to this point, like Blackwood hadn't typically used this strategy of publishing in like cheap pamphlets. Does this kind of explosion change their strategy? Do they use these kinds of networks that they set up again, or
You would have
do
thought
they?
so, but the next time they try something like this is actually with George Eliot's Middlemarch, which is, you know, the big, as you know, was probably wanted it to be published in sequence and sections. So they did it in 7 monthly pamphlets, if you like, or sections, sold off on a cheaper version. That was an experiment on their part because they'd never really experiment. They always did the 3-volume followed by the 2-volume, 1-volume reprint kind of pattern. So it does spark that, but they kind of retreated after that. They went, nah, that's fine. We'll just go back to what we normally do because they're making a lot of money anyway.
I'm going to pursue the same line.
Yeah.
I was interested, they appeared to like invent nonce hawkers. They hired a bunch of boys to sell it on the street, like Chapman and hawkers are selling street literature.
Yeah.
So like, how does this interact with like existing traditions and the imaginary of like hawkers and Chapman selling pamphlets in the street?
Well, they always did that. They just tapped into the network of street vendors.
Oh, I see.
Sorry,
They didn't create new ones.
No, they went, oh, well, street, okay, come on, let's get them all brought in, and then you can start selling our stuff. Because obviously there's a huge network already.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So they didn't invent it. No, it was just tapping into something already there. But yeah, good point.
With the printing, with down by Blackwood in Edinburgh, where was the printing done? Yeah, I really got
Thistle
it.
Street,
You're kidding.
Thistle Street Lane.
Just over there.
So Blackwood's used to be.
Home for comfort.
Yeah, so Blackwood's had their main building on George Street, and then the lane behind it, Thistle Street Lane, which had the printing works.
Yes.
And that's right. So you'd have them trundling the books from the printing over.
Straight down the station and distribute.
Well,
Yeah.
then you just walk down to the Thistle Street, or down to the train station. Where there you are. Yeah.
Very home. No. And I think they had a sort of regiments of female compositors. Also,
What was that?
The printing industry in Edinburgh and Nelson's quintessentially they did that sort of whole centres of
Yes.
city compositors all the time.
Yeah, that occurred because of the strikes in 1872, which I've kind of written about. Yeah, and so that they had strikes across the board, across a number of places, and they brought in women to start setting type, and then that enabled an entry point for them to maintain for about 40, 50 years. And I think Sean Reynolds has written about this in a book called Britannia's Complex Authors, which is really good. And then we're frozen out because back to the male hegemony space again. So,
You said that this Battle of Dorking influenced people like Wells, Chambers, and so on, John Buchan. Did any of them ever acknowledge that?
no.
Well, no.
No, because by then it was just, it's just a novel about. I don't, not that I'm aware of. Maybe they might have been, but I'm not aware of them having specifically said, oh, I read Chesney and I decided I'm going to write the War of the Worlds. But I might be wrong, unless there's an HUL specialist here.
Yes, please.
Are you an HUL specialist?
No,
Oh.
no, well, not
Okay.
no. But from memory, I think there's an implicit, or might be an implicit acknowledgement, and I think there's a chapter in the War of the Worlds called the Battle of Dorking.
Oh, well, I stand corrected. Thank
There we
you.
are.
There we are.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
I'm not actually sure. But I
Okay,
think
I'll take it. Yes, your memory's better than mine.
Okay, any more?
Yep, last one, not least.
No.
Last
This may be a basic one, so you can speak quickly, but I was interested in your use of reports of dinner conversations as evidence. Are these essentially celebrity gossip? Who attended it? How was it edited? Like, how do you think about using that as an evidence? I mean, it's incredible as cultural, but did it actually, like, where do you think about, did that actually happen and what is the site?
Yeah, so what we find in the 19th century newspapers particularly would be that they would report on significant events like, the dinner was held with so-and-so, or there'd be a political statement, or Gladstone would stand up and give a speech. And often they would be it was almost like a stenography kind of thing. They would report they'd report verbatim what they said. So often you'd have them reporting on, like I said, this dinner, they reported on everybody who spoke, and ad nauseum everything they said, to the point where you could actually read the whole thing and go, oh, geez, boy, I'm surprised that they're actually still standing because it was so boring. But then they would have these little bits where they'd say, toast everyone, and then they have the knowing laughter, or hurrah. So there are interjections. So there are, particularly the Scotsman, I found when I was trying to research works and stuff about political strikes that were happening, or strikes that were happening in the 19th century. They would report on these working men's meetings, political meetings, and they reported verbatim, even though it was anathema to their views of what should have been talked about, i.e. union members talking about, striking. So there is what you find in newspapers is it's not hello magazine type thing. It's actually dinner event was held and so-and-so spoke, and so-and-so spoke, and so-and-so spoke. And it's quite, as a result, sometimes if you're capacious enough to read through all these things, you can really come up with some interesting insights into how speech and these events unfurl, and also how they, what the structure is. I find that's another story, another project. Yeah. Oh, good question. Oh, quite. Two men vying for a
No, I'll keep it up short.
Your counsellor.
And you said that Chesney was a liberal disposition, but I may be mistaken, but I'm sure he became a conservative MP later on for some very safe conservative seat.
He did, but
Cambridge.
while he was writing it, he was writing to Blackwood's going, I need to change this and that and the other, because although I'm liberal, it's obviously being interpreted, in a way that is imperiling my position. So he was trying to soften the tone, because he was of the Gladstonian type of thinking. And as you say, obviously, with time, he then shifts. At that stage, he was classifying himself as a liberal. And his letters say that specifically. I'm a liberal! Oh my God, what am I going to do?
Scratch a liberal, get a Tory.
Well, okay, that's another.
He also had quite a very traditional conservative view, because around about page 50 on Battle of Dorking, just a very small 2 sentences, he said, the traditional ruling class of the country is crumbling and the uneducated masses are rising.
Right.
And that's almost.
But again, that's due to revisions that he was making due to Blackwood's as well, coming in and going, change these things as well. But that's another story. Yeah, the whole story about editing things, editorial.
Appears like the case to be aimed at a very educated,
Yes.
middle class, upper middle class audience whom he is boosting. Especially in McKay's book, I mean, they are the heroes of the story. The plucky chartered accountants who go out with the rifle and get shot dead by the dastardly Russians.
Can you imagine all of us going out for maneuvers? I can't imagine that, but anyway, yeah, us going for maneuvers, that'd be fun.
Okay, I think it's getting pretty warm in here.
That's all the heated debate.
But one last question. Anyone?
So, will you, marketing, you made the case for marketing a facsimile with a learned essay. You've just done it. You've made
It's
your own
been done,
marketing.
it's been done. I'm not original, as I said. It's been reprinted various times because people have gone, oh, this is fabulous. And then they rediscover it and go, oh, how come I didn't know about it? And then it gets reprinted and then somebody goes, well, that's really interesting. Yes, so you're right. Yes, it comes back.
One last question. No? Okay, in which case, can we thank David for a stimulating evening?
Thank you very much for listening.
Something I've never heard anything about this before. That's really interesting. Thank you. Okay.
All right.